Section 69, Part 3, Chapter 4 of The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, by Vicente Blasco Ibáñez, translated by Charlotte Brewster Jordan. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4. No One Will Kill Him. 4 months later, Don Marcelo's confidence received a rude shock. Julio was wounded. But at the same time that Lacour brought him this news, lamentably delayed, he tranquilized him with the result of his investigations in the War Ministry. Sergeant Desnoyers was now a sub-lieutenant. His wound was almost healed, and thanks to the wire pulling of the senator, he was coming to pass a fortnight with his family while convalescing. "An exceptionally brave fellow," concluded the influential man. "I have read what his chiefs say about him. At the head of his platoon, he attacked a German company. He killed the captain with his own hand. He did I don't know how many more brave things besides. They have presented him with the military medal and have made him an officer, a regular hero." And the rapidly aging father, weeping with emotion but with increasing enthusiasm, shook his head and trembled. He repented now of his momentary lack of faith when the first news of his wounded boy reached him. How absurd! No one would kill Julio. His heart told him so. Soon after, he saw him coming home amid the cries and delighted exclamations of the women. Poor Dona Luisa wept as she embraced him, hanging on his neck with sobs of emotion. Chichi contemplated him with grave reflection, putting half of her mind on the recent arrival, while the rest flew far away in search of the other warrior. The dusky South American maids fought each other for the opening in the curtains, peering through the crack with the gaze of an antelope. The father admired the little scrap of gold on the sleeve of the gray cloak, with the skirts buttoning behind, examining afterwards the dark blue cap with its low brim, adopted by the French for the war in the trenches. The traditional kepi had disappeared. A suitable visor like that of the men in the Spanish infantry now shadowed Julio's face. Don Marcelo noted, too, the short and well cared for beard, very different from the one he had seen in the trenches. The boy was coming home, groomed and polished from his recent stay in the hospital. "Isn't it true that he looks like me?" queried the old man proudly. Dona Luisa responded with the inconsequence that mothers always show in matters of resemblance. "He has always been the living image of you." Having made sure that he was well and happy, the entire family suddenly felt a certain disquietude. They wished to examine his wound so as to convince themselves that he was completely out of danger. "Oh, it's nothing at all," protested the sub-lieutenant. "A bullet wound in the shoulder. The doctor feared at first that I might lose my left arm, but it has healed well, and it isn't worthwhile to think any more about it." Chichi's appraising glance swept Julio from head to foot, taking in all the details of his military elegance. His cloak was worn thin and dirty, the leggings were spatter-dashed with mud. He smelled of leather, sweaty cloth and strong tobacco, but on one wrist he was wearing a watch, and on the other his identity medal fastened with a gold chain. She had always admired her brother for his natural good taste, so she stowed away all these little details in her memory in order to pass them on to Rene. Then she surprised her mother with a demand for a loan that she might send a little gift to her artilleryman. Don Marcelo gloated over the 15 days of satisfaction ahead of him. Sub-Lieutenant Desnoyers found it impossible to go out alone, for his father was always pacing up and down the reception hall before the military cap, which was shedding modest splendor and glory upon the hat rack. Scarcely had Julio put it on his head before his sire appeared, also with hat and cane, ready to sally forth. "Will you permit me to accompany you? I will not bother you." This would be said so humbly, with such an evident desire to have his request granted, that his son had not the heart to refuse him. In order to take a walk with Argensola, he had to scurry down the back stairs or resort to other schoolboy tricks. Never had the elder Desnoyers promenaded the streets of Paris with such solid satisfaction as by the side of this muscular youth in his gloriously worn cloak, on whose breast were glistening his two decorations, the Cross of War and the military medal. He was a hero, and this hero was his son. He accepted as homage to them both the sympathetic glances of the public in the streetcars and subways, the interest with which the women regarded the fine looking youth tickled him immensely. All the other military men that they met, no matter how many bands and crosses they displayed, appeared to the doting father mere embusques, unworthy of comparison with his Julio. The wounded men who got out of the coaches by the aid of staffs and crutches inspired him with the greatest pity. Poor fellows! They did not bear the charmed life of his son. Nobody could kill him, and when by chance he received a wound, the scars had immediately disappeared without detriment to his handsome person. Sometimes, especially at night, Desnoyers Sr. would show an unexpected magnanimity, letting Julio fare forth alone. Since before the war, his son had led a life filled with triumphant love affairs. What might he not achieve now with the added prestige of a distinguished officer? Passing through his room on his way to bed, the father imagined the hero in the charming company of some aristocratic lady. None but a feminine celebrity was worthy of him. His paternal pride could accept nothing less, and it never occurred to him that Julio might be with Argensola in a music hall or in a moving picture show, enjoying the simple and monotonous diversions of a Paris sobered by war, with the homely tastes of a sub-lieutenant whose amorous conquests were no more than the renewal of some old friendships. One evening, as Don Marcelo was accompanying his son down the Champs Elysees, he started at recognizing a lady approaching from the opposite direction. It was Madame Laurier. Would she recognize Julio? He noted that the youth turned pale and began looking at the other people with feigned interest. She continued straight ahead, erect, unseeing. The old gentleman was almost irritated at such coldness. To pass by his son without feeling his presence instinctively. Ah, these women! He turned his head involuntarily to look after her, but had to avert his inquisitive gaze immediately. He had surprised Marguerite motionless behind them, pallid with surprise, and fixing her gaze earnestly on the soldier who was separating himself from her. Don Marcelo read in her eyes admiration, love, all of the past that was suddenly surging up in her memory. Poor woman! He felt for her a paternal affection, as though she were the wife of Julio. His friend Lacour had again spoken to him about the Lauriers. He knew that Marguerite was going to become a mother, and the old man, without taking into account the reconciliation nor the passage of time, felt as much moved at the thought of this approaching maternity as though the child were going to be Julio's. Meanwhile, Julio was marching right on without turning his head, without being conscious of the burning gaze fixed upon him, colorless, but humming a tune to hide his emotion. He always believed that Marguerite had passed near him without recognizing him, since his father did not betray her. One of Don Marcelo's pet occupations was to make his son tell about the encounter in which he had been hurt. No visitor ever came to see the sub lieutenant, but the father always made the same petition: "Tell us how you were wounded. Explain how you killed that German captain." Julio tried to excuse himself with visible annoyance. He was already surfeited with his own history. To please his father, he had to relate the facts to the senator, to Argensola, and to Tchernoff in his studio, and to other family friends. He simply could not do it again. So the father began the narration on his own account, giving the relief and details of the deed as though seen with his own eyes. He had to take possession of the ruins of a sugar refinery in front of the trench. The Germans had been expelled by the French cannon. A reconnoitering survey under the charge of a trusty man was then necessary, and the heads, as usual, had selected Sergeant Desnoyers. At daybreak the platoon had advanced stealthily without encountering any difficulty. The soldiers scattered among the ruins. Julio then went on alone, examining the positions of the enemy. On turning around a corner of the wall, he had the most unexpected of encounters. A German captain was standing in front of him. They had almost bumped into each other. They looked into each other's eyes with more suspense than hate, yet at the same time they were trying instinctively to kill each other, each one trying to get the advantage by his swiftness. The captain had dropped the map that he was carrying. His right hand sought his revolver, trying to draw it from its case without once taking his eyes off his enemy. Then he had to give this up as useless. It was too late. With his eyes distended by the proximity of death, he kept his gaze fixed upon the Frenchman, who had raised his gun to his face. A shot from a barrel almost touching him, and the German fell dead. Not till then did the victor notice the captain's orderly, who was but a few steps behind. He shot Desnoyers, wounding him in the shoulder. The French hurried to the spot, killing the corporal. Then there was a sharp crossfire with the enemy's company, which had halted a little ways off, while their commander was exploring the ground. Julio, in spite of his wound, continued at the head of his section, defending the factory against superior forces until supports arrived and the land remained definitely in the power of the French. Wasn't that the way of it? Don Marcelo would always wind up. The son assented, desirous that his annoyance with the persistent story should come to an end as soon as possible. Yes, that was the way of it. But what the father didn't know, what Julio would never tell, was the discovery that he had made after killing the captain. The two men, during the interminable second in which they had confronted each other, had showed in their eyes something more than the surprise of an encounter, the wish to overcome the other. Desnoyers knew that man. The captain knew him too. He guessed it from his expression, but self-preservation was more insistent than recollection, and prevented them both from coordinating their thoughts. Desnoyers had fired with the certainty that he was killing someone that he knew. Afterwards, while directing the defense of the position and guarding against the approach of reinforcements, he had a suspicion that the enemy whose corpse was lying a few feet away might possibly be a member of the von Hartrott family. No, he looked much older than his cousins, yet younger than his uncle Karl, who at his age would be no mere captain of infantry. When weakened by the loss of blood, they were about to carry him to the trenches. The sergeant expressed a wish to see again the body of his victim. His doubt continued before the face blanched by death. The wide open eyes still seemed to retain their startled expression. The man had undoubtedly recognized him. His face was familiar. Who was he? Suddenly, in his mind's eye, Julio saw the heaving ocean, a great steamer, a tall, blonde woman looking at him with half-closed eyes of invitation, a corpulent, mustached man making speeches in the style of the Kaiser. "Rest in peace, Captain Erckmann." This culminated in a corner of France. The discussions started at table in mid-ocean. He excused himself mentally, as though he were in the presence of the sweet Bertha. He had had to kill in order not to be killed. Such is war. He tried to console himself by thinking that Erckmann perhaps had failed to identify him, without realizing that his slayer was the shipmate of the summer. And he kept carefully hidden in the depths of his memory this encounter arranged by fate. He did not even tell Argensola, who knew of the incidents of the transatlantic passage. When he least expected it, Don Marcelo found himself at the end of that delightful and proud existence which his son's presence had brought him. The fortnight had flown by so swiftly. The sub-lieutenant had returned to his post, and all the family, after this period of reality, had had to fall back on the fond illusions of hope. watching again for the arrival of his letters, making conjectures about the silence of the absent one, sending him packet after packet of everything that the market was offering for the soldiery, for the most part useless and absurd things. The mother became very despondent. Julio's visit home but made her feel his absence with greater intensity. Seeing him, hearing those tales of death that her husband was so fond of repeating, made her realize all the more clearly the dangers constantly surrounding her son. Fatality appeared to be warning her with funereal presentiments. "They are going to kill him," she kept saying to Desnoyers. "That wound was a forewarning from heaven." When passing through the streets, she trembled with emotion at sight of the invalid soldiers. The convalescents of energetic appearance filled her with the greatest pity. They made her think of a certain trip with her husband to San Sebastian, where a bullfight had made her cry out with indignation and compassion, pitying the fate of the poor gored horses. With entrails hanging, they were taken to the corrals and submitted to a hurried adjustment in order that they might return to the arena, stimulated by a false energy. Again and again they were reduced to this makeshift cobbling, until finally a fatal goring finished them. These recently cured men continually brought to her mind those poor beasts. Some had been wounded 3 times since the beginning of the war, and were returning surgically patched together and regalvanized to take another chance in the lottery of fate, always in the expectation of the supreme blow. Ay, her son! Desnoyers waxed very indignant over his wife's low spirits, retorting, "But I tell you that nobody will kill Julio. He is my son. In my youth I, too, passed through great dangers. They wounded me, too, in the wars in the other world, and nevertheless, here I am at a ripe old age." Events seemed to reinforce his blind faith. Calamities were raining around the family and saddening his relatives, yet not one grazed the intrepid sub lieutenant, who was persisting in his daring deeds with the heroic nerve of a musketeer. Section 69